Hey guys, tonight we begin with an incredible alternate reality in the Otherverse. A story of what happens when the world takes a breath and forgets to exhale. Where the clocks stop, the noise stills, and you are the only one left to notice. So go ahead and get comfortable. Let the stillness settle in. Let us drift now into the very beginning of a moment that never ended. It began on a day that was supposed to be like any other. I remember the small things first, the sound of shoes on pavement, the low murmur of conversation coming from a cafe behind me, the metallic groan of a bus kneeling to the curb, the familiar rhythm of the crosswalk beeping in intervals. I had just stepped off the sidewalk onto the street when it happened, not with a bang. Not even with a whisper, but with the absence of both. A second, a perfectly ordinary second, began to stretch, not into a minute, but into something else entirely. It was as if the world had taken a breath, and then, quite without warning, refused to let it out again. Everything held still, not paused, not hesitating, but absolutely still. I blinked once and felt the muscles in my face complete the motion, but the world around me did not blink back. The breeze that had been brushing against my cheek simply stopped, not slowed. It clung there, weightless and obedient to nothing. A bird mid-flight, just above the traffic light, hung in the air like a painted thing, wings outstretched, beak parted. A feather frozen just an inch behind its tail. The cars at the intersection sat in perfect silence, drivers mid-turn of their heads, mouths half opened as if caught between thoughts. One man on a bike looked like he was about to swerve, his balance on the edge of collapse. Yet he remained perfectly still. I walked forward slowly, hearing the sound of my own steps echo strangely on the pavement. Each step seemed louder than it should have been, not because I was stomping, but because there was no other noise at all to compete with it. My breathing felt sharper, the fabric of my jacket brushing against itself too loudly, the creak of my joints more intimate than I had ever known. I remember calling out, once, then twice, and then again, louder. There was no answer, not even the slightest shift in response. Not a head turned, not an eye blinked. My voice came back to me like it was hitting the walls of an empty canyon, bouncing off glass and stone alike. I started moving faster, weaving between people, brushing shoulders that felt warm but lifeless. One woman had a hand stretched toward her phone just above her lap, as if waiting for it to fall. A dog in a leash stood stiff-legged, tongue out, fur caught in mid-ripple, like a fountain suspended in time. I placed my hand on the dog's side and felt warmth, breath caught in its lungs, but no heartbeat, no twitch, no life that moved with mine. I pushed into stores, into alleyways, through buses with open doors and half-stepped passengers. No one moved, no one breathed, and yet nothing was cold. This was not death. I do not know why, but I never thought that. The people were not corpses. They were simply paused, as if someone had pressed a button far above my comprehension, and the entire machinery of time had obeyed. I could feel my own heart still beating, still pounding even. Faster now with the creeping realization. My eyes watered from too much blinking, from searching too hard for someone who would blink back. I remember finding a small electronics store, the kind that sells chargers and cracked screen repairs. Its front display was still lit, screens showing the same blinking advertisements I had seen so many times before, but now they were not blinking. The scrolling text had frozen in a strange in-between state, mid-pixel, like someone had sliced the image into thin strips and glued them together out of sequence. I went behind the counter, found a small battery-powered radio, and turned it on. Nothing, just the hollow click of buttons that no longer connected to anything. I pressed my ear against the speaker, willing it to crackle. Still silence. I turned on every radio I could find, every television, every piece of communication equipment, but none of them spoke. I do not remember how long I wandered that first day, if it even was a day. The light never changed. The sun hovered somewhere above the skyline, unmoving, its rays warm but unwavering. Shadows did not grow or shift. The world had been placed under a glass bell, and the hands that usually turned the crank had simply let go. I kept hoping with every street I turned onto that I would see someone walking, just one person, anyone, a sign that this strange silence had missed a soul besides my own. But every road was filled with the same sculptures of life. A man opening a newspaper, a girl mid-laugh, an elderly woman adjusting the strap of her purse. None of them finished their gestures. None of them returned to motion. I started talking out loud just to hear something, anything. I said my name. I recited poetry I barely remembered from school. I hummed songs and tried to whistle, but even that sounded unnatural in the stale, unwavering air. Eventually, I screamed, not out of fear, but out of a kind of hollow desperation. I wanted to break the spell, to crack the glass with volume alone, but the sound did not carry the way it should have. It bounced and fell flat, swallowed by a sky that no longer listened. I leaned against a lamppost and slid to the ground, not crying, not shaking, just still like everything else, but alone in my movement. I do not remember sleeping. I must have. The body demands it, but without nightfall, without time marking its edges. There was no boundary between waking and rest, only the soft pull of exhaustion and the aching solitude that filled every corner of this unmoving world. When I opened my eyes again, it was the same street, the same pose of the woman across from me reaching into her handbag, her fingers eternally just above the clasp. I stood, brushed the dust from my coat, and walked. There was no point in staying still. I was not sure there was a point in moving either, but stillness felt like surrender, and I was not ready for that yet. The next places I visited were homes, some unlocked, some requiring a gentle push with a shoulder or a rock through the glass. I tried to pick the ones that looked lived in, fresh coffee on the table, music mid-play on a turntable, someone's coat still hanging on the hook by the door. I would step inside softly, as if the people might still be there just behind the silence. I would whisper apologies, not wanting to startle the still air. I was not sure what I was looking for. Clues, maybe. A diary, a calendar, a clock that had kept running. Anything to explain why I was still moving when the rest of the world had stopped. But there was never an answer, only more paused lives. I remember sitting on someone's couch next to a frozen couple watching television. The man had his arm draped lazily over the back of the cushions, his other hand wrapped around a soda can. The condensation still clung to the metal. The woman's lips were parted slightly, maybe caught in the start of a laugh. They looked peaceful. It was almost comforting until it was not, because the longer I stared, the more I realized I could sit there forever, and they would never blink, never shift, never breathe. I stood and left without touching anything else by the end of that first stretch. Whether it was a day or a week or some unmeasurable stretch of now, I had stopped asking what had happened. the question became too heavy to carry. Instead, I just asked what to do next, not to fix it. I never believed I could fix it, but to live inside it, to walk gently through a world that no longer moved, a world that felt like it had turned itself inside out, where every sound was my own, every motion mine alone. I did not feel like a god. I did not feel powerful. I felt like a ghost, not dead, but separated from the living by something I could neither see nor name. And still, even then, some part of me kept hoping, quiet and stubborn. Maybe, just maybe, around the next corner, someone else might be blinking too. The day after I stopped believing it was a mistake, or at least after I stopped hoping it was, I decided to search more deliberately. I had not truly explored yet, not properly. I had drifted. I had wandered through streets and stores, caught in disbelief. But I had not made a plan. That morning, if you could call it morning, since the light never shifted and shadows never moved, I left the house I had slept in and walked with purpose. I did not know where I was going, only that I needed to move, to press outward into the city as though somewhere someone might still be breathing beside me. I told myself I would not stop until I found them. I began with the apartments, not the small ones over the corner shops, but the larger buildings near the edge of downtown where you had to be buzzed in. The first one took some effort. I pushed against the glass doors until the latch gave slightly under the strain, and then I climbed the stairs, slowly, stepping over a boy frozen mid-sprint, one sneaker off his heel. My fist ached by the time I reached the third floor, but no one answered. I called out through the halls, peered through the windows beside each door, and sometimes let myself in when the doors were not locked. Inside always the same, meals half prepared, lamps on, chairs pulled out, life in mid-motion, but no breath, no pulse, no witness. From the apartments, I moved to the parks. I thought maybe the openness would help. Maybe I would see someone in the distance, a runner, or a parent with a stroller, someone who had escaped the stillness. The air was warmer there, touched by flowers that had not wilted, grass that stood tall and green despite the absence of time. Squirrels clung to tree trunks in permanent vertical stretches. A kite floated just above the hill, its string still caught in a boy's hands. I sat beside him for a while, tracing the lines of his face with my eyes, wondering what expression had formed just before the moment froze. His lips were tight, focused, not joy, not fear, just the kind of look you make when you are steering something into the wind. I began shouting, not loud at first, but louder as I moved. "Is anyone here?" I would yell, pacing between the benches. "Hello." Sometimes I would follow it up with a laugh, not because anything was funny, but because the sound felt like it broke through something, even if just inside me. There was never an answer, not in the parks, not in the subway stations, not in the church I wandered into with its doors flung wide and a priest paused mid-step at the pulpit, hand raised to adjust his glasses. His other hand held a folded note. I took it and read it, then carefully slid it back between his fingers. By the time I reached the train yard, something in me had begun to let go of the hope I had clung to. Not because I wanted to, I did not, but because it was becoming heavier to carry than the silence itself. The tracks stretched out in both directions, disappearing behind buildings and fences, but the trains were all frozen. One engine puffed steam into the air that never rose. It hovered in a curved shape, just above the spout, like a porcelain sculpture, white and soft and unmoving. I climbed into the conductor's cabin and sat in the seat, resting my hands on the controls. I moved one lever slowly, not expecting anything, and nothing happened, not even a creak. I pressed buttons, flipped switches, but the train was as still as the world around it. I stayed there for hours, maybe longer. It was hard to tell. The stillness blurred the hours together until I only knew time had passed because my limbs began to ache and hunger returned. I left the yard with slower steps than I had arrived with. I still glanced at every person I passed, still checked for the twitch of a finger, the shift of an eye, still leaned close to faces I did not know, hoping to feel breath on my cheek. But each time there was nothing. The silence was not loud. It was not like a vacuum. It was delicate, like the world had been wrapped in soft cloth and buried under the weight of its own memory. I made my way to the hospital next. I had not planned on it, but the building appeared on the horizon, and something in me turned toward it, curious or desperate, or both. Inside the halls were full, stretchers halfway down corridors. Nurses stopped in mid-sentence with charts in hand. One man in a coat was turning toward a nurse, finger raised like he was correcting something. A woman in a gown sat in a wheelchair, her head tilted slightly, a magazine in her lap. I walked slowly past her and into one of the rooms. The machines there were frozen too, screens stuck on whatever numbers they had held when the world stopped. I stood by the bed of an old man hooked up to a ventilator. His eyes were closed, peaceful. If I had not known better, I would have said he was sleeping. I leaned against the window in the room and looked out over the street below. It was the same street I had walked earlier, just from a higher place. The same motionless cars, the same half-step pedestrians. I wondered how long I would keep looking, how long hope would survive once it had nothing to feed on. And still some part of me whispered, check the next room, check the next building, just one more block. Maybe the stillness is not everywhere. I went to the university next. It was farther than I expected. A walk that would have taken 15 minutes felt like an hour, not because my body was slower, but because every step felt heavier now. The gates were open. The quad was filled with students, some mid-gesture, some laughing, some running, books half flipped on benches, a frisbee caught in the air between two players. I passed them all, weaving between frozen limbs and wide smiles, trying to memorize their shapes as though I might forget what real motion looked like. Inside the library, I found warmth, not literal. The temperature had not changed, but something else, comfort, memory. It smelled the same as all libraries do, paper and wood and dust and ink, familiar. I spoke out loud in the reading room, not a yell this time, just a sentence. If anyone else is here, please, please say something. My voice echoed softly against the high ceilings. I listened, as if the walls might answer. When they did not, I picked up a book and read aloud. The sound of words, again, even borrowed ones, made me feel less invisible. I read for hours, or maybe minutes. It was impossible to tell. I imagined someone in the far corner, just behind a bookshelf, finally hearing me, stepping out, blinking with the same quiet wonder, but no one came. That night, if it could be called that, I found a rooftop to sleep on, not for comfort, just to feel the city from a different angle. I looked down on the still traffic, the shops with their lights forever glowing, The restaurants with meals cooling on tables that no one would ever taste. I traced the skyline with my eyes and tried to picture it as it once was, with sound and motion, with stories unfolding in every window. I realized then that I was not just searching for someone. I was searching for proof that the world still had a heartbeat, that it had not stopped entirely, that somewhere under all this glassy silence, something was still alive. I woke with the sun still fixed in the same place. I blinked and stretched and looked out again, but the city had not moved. I climbed down and wandered again. The museum this time, the art gallery, the zoo, places filled with motion or the memory of it. I stood in front of sculptures and paintings and cages, hoping again for a flicker. Nothing ever stirred. Not the lion, not the child feeding popcorn to pigeons, not even the wind in the trees. I walked all day, or what felt like all day. Every alley, every tunnel, every square. The further I went, the more I realized there were too many faces to count, too many frozen moments, too many breaths held mid-air. The world was still too full of people, and yet I had never felt so completely alone. I returned that evening to the same bench I had passed earlier in the park. The woman with the sunglasses still sat there, head tilted back, lips parted like she was saying something just before the silence fell. I sat beside her, leaned forward with my elbows on my knees, and just stared out over the pond. The ducks were frozen too, one mid-splash, droplets like glass around its neck. I whispered, softly now, not a plea, just a greeting. If you are here, you can come sit with me. I will not ask questions. There was no reply, of course, but saying it made me feel less like I was unraveling. That night, I started leaving notes, little ones, folded pieces of paper slipped into pockets, taped to walls, tucked under frozen fingers, just in case someone woke up after me, just in case someone else was searching too. I wrote my name, the date, or what I thought the date was. I wrote where I planned to go next. I wrote that they were not alone, even if I never heard back. It was something, a seed I could leave behind in the silence, a whisper into the void. And still every morning I opened my eyes with the same question in my chest. Is anyone else awake? It started with a dull ache, not panic and not desperation, just a quiet and persistent need that gnawed gently at the edges of my awareness. Hunger, I realized, came more softly when no one was around to remind you that you were supposed to feel it. There were no smells from sidewalk food stands, and no rumble of a neighbor's microwave, and no laughter over shared dinners. Just a hollow feeling that rose slowly inside me like mist through the floorboards. I tried to ignore it at first, as if denial could stretch the moment a little longer and keep me suspended in that drifting space between fear and wonder. But time, my time, whatever that meant now, had not stopped, and my body kept moving forward while the world stood still. The first time I took something, I did it with shaking hands. A small corner store with windows streaked in city grime sat just off the intersection where I had first noticed the silence. The bell above the door did not ring. The air inside was stale, but somehow comforting, like stepping into a memory. The shopkeeper stood behind the counter with one hand halfway to a pack of gum and eyes frozen mid-glance toward the register. His presence unsettled me more than I expected. I muttered an apology out of instinct, even though I knew he could not hear. My fingers hovered over a granola bar for too long, as though waiting for some cosmic permission. When I finally picked it up, the plastic wrapper crinkled in my hand like it was shouting. I left the store slowly and did not look back, and chewed in silence, as if the act itself might wake someone. Over the next few days, the anxiety softened. Hunger crept in again, and I answered it. Not because I wanted to become the kind of person who takes, but because I did not know what else to do. Supermarkets became places of strange reverence. I walked the aisles gently, as if shopping among statues. A man in an apron crouched near a stack of apples, with one hand stretched out mid-toss. I never touched him. I never touched any of them. I only moved through the spaces between their stillness, whispering apologies. I did not expect anyone to hear. Water was harder to find. Bottles on shelves helped for a while, but when I began searching homes, it was usually glasses left, half full, with condensation clinging to the surface that quenched my thirst. That realization that I had stepped across some invisible line into people's private worlds made my chest tighten. I tried to be respectful, whatever that meant now. I entered homes only when I felt truly desperate, and even then, I moved through them with the care of someone leafing through an old diary not meant for them. Some houses felt untouched, as if their owners had just stepped out. Blankets were still folded, and dishes were still warm in the sink, and books lay open on armrests. Others were messier, chaotic moments caught mid-motion. Children's toys were scattered across rugs, and jackets were dropped halfway to the door, and a spilled drink waited on a countertop that would never be cleaned. I never lingered long in those homes. The sense of interruption was too much to bear. I took a few crackers or a bottle of juice and left quietly, and sometimes I placed the item exactly where I had found its twin, so nothing would feel off when or if the world resumed. Eventually, I began seeking out comfort and not just survival. I found myself drawn to homes with soft lighting and warm furniture, and bookshelves arranged by color or theme, places that felt lived in but calm. There was one townhouse with navy curtains and a velvet chaise by the window. The walls were lined with framed sketches, pencil drawings of birds and trees, some unfinished and some delicately signed in the corner. I never met the artist, but I spoke to them often in my head. I imagined their routines, their favorite teas, the way their hands might have moved across the page. I left their house untouched for the most part, except for the windows. I opened them to let the light in. It felt like something they would have done. Sleeping became easier when I stopped trying to sleep in my own bed. It was too familiar and too anchored in a version of life that no longer existed. So I wandered from room to room across the city, sometimes staying in lofts with tall ceilings, and other times in cottages tucked behind ivy walls. The bed did not matter as much as the feeling, the sense that I was borrowing space with gratitude rather than taking it. I folded blankets when I left, and I straightened pillows, and I whispered thank you before closing the door, like a guest who did not want to overstay. Clothing was another matter. My own grew stale, and laundry no longer worked, so I adapted. At first, I wore only what I found in shops, still-tagged sweaters and soft cotton socks folded into drawers. Later, I turned to closets. I chose carefully only items that looked unworn or that I imagined would not be missed. There was something deeply human about sliding into someone else's coat and feeling the weight of their life settle on your shoulders. I always left the rest of their wardrobe untouched, a silent promise that I was only passing through. It was strange how quickly the world began to feel less like a place and more like a story I had stepped into. A story paused at its peak with every detail preserved with almost too much care. A man with a guitar sat cross-legged on a park bench, strumming a chord that would never finish. I sat beside him once and tried to guess the song. I made up words to match the melody I imagined and hummed softly while pigeons remained mid-step across the cobblestone. In that moment, it felt like we were playing together, him stuck in silence and me borrowing the music from the shape of his hands. Museums became my sanctuaries, not for their exhibits, though I walked their halls in awe, but because they were already built for silence. The stillness did not feel wrong there. I wandered galleries for hours, reading every placard and touching marble busts with a reverence I never had when crowds pressed behind me. In one room, a woman stood frozen in front of a Monet. I stood beside her for a long time, quietly trying to see the painting through her eyes. I wondered what she had been thinking and what memory the colors might have stirred. I imagined she was remembering her grandmother's garden or a trip to the sea. I whispered those stories to her in case they brought comfort. After a while, I stopped counting days. The passage of time was no longer something measured by calendars or alarms. It was marked instead by needs, hunger, thirst, sleep, and by the slow change in the way I saw the world around me. Someone who did not own the story, but who had been asked by some strange twist of fate to carry it forward. I learned not to take more than I needed. I learned to clean up after myself, to return books to shelves, to leave rooms just as I had found them. In some quiet way, I hoped that when or if it all began moving again, people would return to find their lives just as they had left them, untouched except for a few gentle signs that someone had cared in their absence. There was a library downtown that became my refuge. I chose a corner near the philosophy section and surrounded myself with books I never would have reached for before. I read slowly, savoring each line, and sometimes I read aloud just to hear a voice again. I did not recognize my own voice at first, not for anyone in particular, but simply pages of wandering thoughts. I left them in journals I found tucked between books, scribbled on napkins, folded, and placed where someone might find them later. Little fragments of a life still in motion. I did not sign them. I did not need to. Eventually, the world began to feel like something not just frozen, but suspended, as though it was holding its breath in anticipation. I did not know what it was waiting for. Maybe nothing. Maybe me. Or maybe this was simply how things were now. A world paused. A person left, moving. A story gently borrowed from time itself. I do not remember exactly when it changed from surviving to exploring. Perhaps it was after I had slept in a dozen beds across the city and realized that none of them would ever feel like my own. Or perhaps it happened the day I stood on the roof of a silent supermarket and watched the clouds remain still above me, while the air refused to move around my body. Only a gentle shift, a quiet curiosity that crept in when fear had begun to dull and hunger had learned to wait its turn. With the world frozen around me and no clocks left to chase, I began to wonder what I could do simply because I could, not out of need, not to survive. Cautious but curious, I let myself into the local museum, the one I used to pass every week without entering. It was quiet, more so than ever before. The tall marble halls no longer echoed with footsteps or whispers, only the sound of my own breath as I wandered between exhibits. I touched the glass. That alone felt strange, like stepping across a line I had always known never to cross. My fingertips left smudges on the pristine cases, and I did not wipe them away. I traced the curve of a sculpture's neck. I ran my hand across the smooth surface of a suit of armor. I sat on the long wooden bench in front of a painting and stayed there until I forgot how long I had been sitting. I was not looking for meaning. I was not trying to learn. I simply wanted to feel the shape of things that had once been forbidden. From the museum, I moved to the theater. Its grand facade had always seemed too polished for me, a place for people who made reservations and wore black jackets and clutched. But now the doors opened with a gentle push, and the lobby still smelled faintly of velvet and perfume. I walked slowly through rows of red seats, careful not to disturb anything, even though I could not have if I tried. I joined him there. I walked slowly across the scuffed boards and stood beside him in the spotlight that no longer warmed the stage. I whispered a few lines from plays I barely remembered, not for performance, just to feel the shape of words in my mouth again. It felt foolish and beautiful. One evening, I slipped into a convertible, one of those cars I had only seen in glossy photographs or parked behind ropes in museum displays. It had leather seats that smelled of dust and polish, and when I touched the wheel, I almost laughed. I pushed it into neutral and let it coast slowly down the hill near the park. It rolled past frozen pigeons, and cyclists paused mid-pedal. I imagined the engine roaring to life beneath me. I imagined the sound of wind rushing past my ears. Of course, none of that happened, but the pretending was enough to make my chest ache with something that felt like joy. I tried on clothes that were not mine. I wore silk scarves and trench coats and evening gowns and hiking gear. I played dress-up in full daylight, not because I wanted to look good for anyone. There was no one left to see, but because I wanted to feel like someone new, even if only for an hour. I danced in ballroom shoes that clicked softly on polished wooden floors. I wore sunglasses inside quiet restaurants and sat at tables set for two. I imagined conversations that would never happen. I filled the silence with the memory of voices that never arrived. Books became my longest companions. I read without urgency, letting each page drift softly from one hand to the next. I read novels I had always meant to start, and histories I barely understood, cookbooks and philosophy and tales written for children, science fiction full of worlds that moved far faster than mine. I read in cafes and in libraries and on benches placed in warm courtyards filled with still shadows. Sometimes I read aloud just to fill the air with something gentler than my own thoughts. Other times, I let the words collect inside my head like quiet snowflakes gathering without sound. I started keeping stacks of books in every place I rested. My bookmarks became receipts, and torn napkins and twine I found tied around old boxes. I would reread the same paragraph over and over, not because I had forgotten its meaning, but because I liked the shape of its rhythm in the stillness. There were rooftops I had never seen before that slowly became my favorite places. I climbed fire escapes and ladders past rusted vents and still laundry lines until I reached the flat tops that looked out across the silent city. I brought blankets with me and warm tea that never stayed warm for long, but comforted me anyway. I lay back beneath unmoving skies and let the weight of the air rest across my chest like a hand that never pressed too hard. I spoke to the buildings and to the birds and to stars I gave new names. I made constellations from nothing but memory and whispered their stories into the wind like secrets passed between dreamers. Some days I broke into music shops and sat at instruments I had never learned to play. Violins that trembled under fingers, unsure how to hold them. Guitars that groaned softly when I strummed too hard. Flutes that stayed quiet no matter how gently I breathed through them. I sat behind drum kits and tapped out rhythms that no one would ever hear. I was not skilled, and I did not pretend to be, but it never mattered. There was no one to impress, no crowd to cheer, no audience to judge, only the quiet music of wood and metal and breath echoing softly through rooms that no longer carried sound. The longer I stayed, the bolder I became. I explored places I never could have entered before. Hotel suites with tall ceilings and folded towels. Office towers where papers floated above desks in mid-fall. I sat in the judge's chair in an empty courtroom and leaned against the counter in bakeries where croissants had not cooled. I hosted dinners for mannequins dressed in scarves and wide hats. I wrote menus for meals that could never be made. I lit candles and placed forks and imagined conversations between people who would never speak again. I danced in supermarket aisles and filled carts with strange combinations of items and left them parked in the middle of frozen stores as puzzles for a world that might someday wake again. At first, these moments made me laugh, a full, warm kind of laughter that echoed against the walls too loudly and startled even me. But after a while, the joy began to feel like something borrowed, like wearing someone else's jacket, still warm but never quite mine. The games did not stop, but they slowed. I became more careful. I stepped lighter. I began to feel the absence more clearly in the places I had once celebrated it. The empty seat across the table, the silence that followed a joke, the sound of a door that would never open to greet me. Even the wildest adventures began to end with the same quiet breath, a pause in which I remembered that none of this had changed, that nothing had answered back, that the laughter was mine alone, and so was the echo, that I was the only one moving, the only one aging, the only one who remembered the rhythm of footsteps and the sound of someone else humming beside me. So I turned to quieter things. I walked slowly through art galleries and studied each painting stroke by stroke. I sat in church pews and listened for the fading shape of old prayers. I stood in aquariums and watched fish drift through their glass world, never blinking. I wandered gardens where flowers bloomed in air that had not moved in weeks. I felt the petals and the leaves and the stones beneath my hands and tried to let that be enough. I stopped measuring time with days. I counted books instead. I counted rooftops and melodies hummed to the clouds. I let go of the question of how long it had been and stopped wondering when it might end. I let myself become part of this suspended dream, a dream that did not belong to me, but also would not let me leave. And somewhere, in all the wandering, in all the playing and the quiet pretending, I began to understand something that had always escaped me before. That time was never really made from numbers or calendars or clocks. Time was built from meaning, from the weight of moments shared, from knowing someone else was holding the other side of the memory. And without that, I was not sure what to call what I was doing. It felt like living, but softly, like singing a song that only I remembered the words to, and still the world stayed paused around me. Every window showed the same frozen shapes. Every room fell back into stillness the moment I left it. Every step I took left no echo and no mark behind. But even so, I kept walking. I did not know how to stop. Not yet. It is strange how, even in a world held mid-breath, some things keep changing. The sky never moves. The wind never stirs. But somehow I am growing older. Time is no longer counted by the ticking of clocks. Those have all stopped, their hands forever still. Time is now felt in the slow transformation of my body. Hair that grows past my shoulders. A bruise that fades over days I cannot name. Muscles that ache after long walks. I am still ticking, even if the world has stopped around me. In the beginning, it felt like magic, a still life I could walk through and explore. But slowly, I began to notice patterns, invisible rules, quiet laws that shaped the silence. Fire, for example, did not exist anymore. Matches scratched wood but made no flame. Lighters clicked and clicked again, but remained cold. Stove burners never lit. It was as if the very idea of heat had been tucked away, like combustion itself had been locked behind some curtain I could never reach. Cooking became impossible. I stopped trying. Meals became things found, not made. Loaves left uneaten in warm bakeries. Ripe fruit waiting patiently in grocery bins. Honey in untouched cupboards. I began to collect food instead of prepare it. Water followed its own logic. Faucets no longer flowed. No matter how long I waited, nothing moved. But glasses already filled stayed full. Bottles remained sealed and usable. Puddles remained cool and still. Once I saw a single droplet frozen in mid-air beneath a dripping tap. I touched it, and it melted against my skin. Electricity followed its own peculiar rhythm. Lights stayed on, but only if they had already been on when everything stopped. Screens glowed with frozen images, and phones buzzed softly until their batteries gave out. Devices worked only so long as they had not yet asked anything new of the world. Once off, they stayed off. There was no recharging and no rebooting. I learned to use them sparingly. Lamps left on in cozy corners and radios mid-song that never finished. I would sit beside a television, still displaying a paused frame from a morning broadcast, imagining what came next and filling the silence with quiet stories of my own. Movement, too, had rules. Not everything could be shifted. Some doors opened easily, while others resisted, held fast by an invisible pressure I could not push past. Sometimes an object, an umbrella or a stack of books or a bicycle, would seem light at first only to become strangely heavy. When I tried to move it too far, as if the world itself had a threshold for change. Not a punishment, but a quiet discouragement. A gentle hand reminding me not to take too much and not to alter things beyond what was necessary. I started to respect those boundaries, to move through the world more thoughtfully, touching things only when needed and never forcing what resisted. Bodies had their own strange physics. People frozen in motion remained, just as they had been in the final instant. Smiles half-formed, hands mid-wave, feet raised above the pavement in steps that would never land. Sometimes I would adjust a jacket that had slipped from someone's shoulder, or tuck a fallen strand of hair behind an ear. Small gestures of care that felt oddly sacred. But I never tried to move them more than that. The one time I attempted to reposition someone entirely. Their limbs had pushed back, not with force, but with a resistance that was both physical and emotional, as if some part of them still belonged elsewhere, and my touch had crossed a boundary I did not understand. I left them be after that and never tried again. There were other signs that the world did not belong to me. Flowers in vases never wilted, candles never melted. A single snowfall that had begun the day it all stopped never finished. Each flake suspended, mid-air and mid-fall, like a delicate constellation I could walk through but never change. The wind never blew. Leaves never fell. The world had become a gallery of paused moments, and I was the only visitor left wandering the halls. Even sound had its boundaries. My own footsteps echoed softly, and my breathing was still audible in my ears. But there was no sound beyond me. No birdsong, no traffic, no hum of distant life. I could speak or sing or even shout, and the air would carry my voice, but only for me. Nothing ever answered. No noise ever replied. It made speaking feel more like remembering than communicating, as though I was not talking to the world, but to myself through the veil of silence. Some things persisted. Lights that stayed on, and the faint hum of a refrigerator in a kitchen I now visited often. I found comfort in those steady sounds, brief illusions of continuity, like traces of the world that once was. But I learned not to rely on them. Eventually, even the strongest battery failed, and even the warmest light went out. When it did, I let it go. I never tried to fix it. I understood by then that I was not here to maintain anything, just to witness, just to endure. As weeks turned into months, maybe years, time was soft now and hard to measure. I began writing my own rules, not etched into stone, but held quietly in my mind, like guidelines whispered between breaths. Do not waste. Do not break what cannot be repaired. Do not forget that this is not your world, only one you are borrowing for a little while. I lived by them not because I feared consequences, but because I needed structure. The rules gave me something steady in the formlessness, a sense that I still belonged to something even if that something was invisible. Routine helped. I started each day with a walk through familiar streets, paths I knew so well I could have traced them blindfolded. I stopped in doorways to read the expressions of people I would never meet. I left small offerings, flowers, or drawings, or written notes, beside frozen figures I had grown fond of. These gestures became part of my rhythm, a quiet language of presence, not to change the world, but to live alongside it in a way that felt gentle. And still my body changed. Clothes grew tight, then loose again. Hair darkened in places and lightened in others. Scars came and went. It was a slow erosion of sameness, each shift marking the quiet truth that time, though halted for all else, had not abandoned me. At night, I would lie in beds that were not mine, in homes I had never seen before the world froze. And I would listen to the silence as though it might finally say something back, but it never did. Over time, I learned which homes felt kind, which ones had soft chairs, good light, half-finished puzzles left on coffee tables. I stayed longer in those places, not because I needed to, but because it felt like companionship. The belongings of others became a strange sort of conversation, a way of being seen by those who could not see me. A house with children's drawings taped to the wall. A kitchen with flour still dusting the counter. A record player paused mid-song, each one a fragment of someone else's rhythm, now borrowed by mine. The world was still and full of stories, and I moved among them like a quiet guest, no longer searching for why I was left behind, but learning instead how to live within the answerless stillness, and in that silence, surrounded by the frozen heartbeat of the world, I found a kind of peace, not the peace of understanding, but the peace of acceptance, of learning the rules, not so I could break them, but so I could belong to the stillness without disturbing it. The walls of the little apartment had become more than shelter. They marked something quietly sacred now, a way to measure the days that refused to move on their own. Time, though frozen around me, still passed within. Hair grew longer, nails needed trimming, muscles ached in the same way they always had, and sleep came and went in its own rhythm, indifferent to the stillness outside. At some point, the idea formed to mark the passing days, a chalk line on the inside of a cabinet door, scratched carefully just below the hinge where no one else would see. It was not much, but it gave shape to something shapeless, a tally of something real. Each morning, or what passed for morning since the sky had stayed locked in the same strange light, another mark was added. Not out of routine exactly, but more out of curiosity. What would it feel like to see time made visible again, even if only on a cupboard door? There was no calendar to match it to, only instinct. A gut sense of rhythm, like counting heartbeats or breaths. The marks grew slowly, unevenly spaced, some days blurred together. Sometimes whole handfuls of days passed without a new line, but over time a rough count emerged. Days turned into weeks, then months, eventually a full year. The realization came gently, without fanfare, a day like any other, until the eye lingered longer on the cabinet and the count became undeniable. A year had passed, or something very close to it. And with that thought, another followed behind it. The idea of a birthday, not a celebration exactly, and certainly not a party, but something small, something human. There were crackers in the pantry, still fresh enough. A bar of chocolate taken weeks ago from the corner store, carefully rationed, but never entirely forgotten. A small jar of preserves. Together, they could almost be imagined as a cake. Not a real one, of course. Not one that needed baking or candles or singing, but something symbolic. Something to hold in two hands and pretend for a moment that the world still moved with me. On a small plate from the cupboard, the sweets were arranged with care. Nothing fancy, just stacked carefully with a bit of red jam spooned on top like icing. A birthday cake made from silence. A stub of candle found in a drawer beneath expired coupons and old pens was pressed into the middle. The flame caught with a single strike of the lighter, one of the few things that still behaved as expected in this world. The flame burned bright in the stillness, its flicker the only motion for miles. Everything else outside the circle of its light remained untouched. People in the neighboring apartments still paused, mid-laugh, mid-reach, mid-thought. The hum of the refrigerator had stopped months ago. There was no ticking clock, no music, no distant rumble of city noise, only the soft crackle of the wick and the thudding quiet of a heart still beating alone. A song was hummed, not out loud at first, but just beneath the breath. Then, without quite meaning to, the voice emerged, unsteady, thin at first, then stronger. A song sung only for the self, echoing strangely in the unmoving air, not cheerful, not mournful either, just something in between. The kind of sound made when a memory slips loose and takes shape in a room where no one else will ever hear it. When the candle was blown out, the smoke curled up toward a ceiling that never darkened. The gesture was instinctive, a ritual even here. It meant something, not that a wish would come true, There was no magic left to expect that, but the act itself, the extinguishing, was enough. It drew a line, a before and an after, a marking of something finished and something begun. Later, sitting by the window, it was easy to picture how things might have looked if they had not stopped. Down in the courtyard, a woman held a bag of groceries, caught mid. A child beside her looked up, mouth open in mid-sentence. A bird hovered just above a railing, wings fully outstretched but motionless, as if the air had thickened to glass. They were all still the same, exactly as they had been. Time had left them behind, or perhaps protected them, wrapping their moments in amber, untouchable. But something else had happened in me. A soft erosion. The body still changed. Hair had to be trimmed with scissors that never dulled. Clothes no longer fit the way they once did. The mirror showed subtle changes, not dramatic, but steady. Skin shifted in tone. The angles of the face became a little less familiar. Even voice, when spoken aloud, had taken on a quieter quality, a different timbre, as if time passed differently when spoken into silence. That day, after the candle and the song and the sitting by the window, the decision was made to begin a journal, not out of a desire to explain anything, but simply to place something down, something that moved, even if the world did not. A notebook was found in the drawer of an office desk a few blocks away. Leather-bound, nearly full of old receipts and appointment reminders, the first few pages were torn out. The rest filled slowly, line by line, with whatever thoughts arrived. At first, the entries were short, observations, little things noticed while walking. A flower blooming behind a shop gate, or a fallen newspaper frozen mid-flutter. But as the pages turned, the writing deepened. Some days it became a conversation, a way to speak back to a world that never answered. Other days it was enough just to describe a meal or a dream, or the memory of a voice that once spoke a name with warmth. The journal became its own measure of time, not days exactly, but something close. An internal calendar, each page its own step forward, proof that motion still existed, at least in this small way. One evening, though of course the sky refused to darken, so evening remained a guess. The idea came to explore a different part of the city, not out of necessity, but out of restlessness, a longing to see something new. Not much had changed, of course. Every street corner still held the same people in the same positions. Cars remained parked mid-turn. A dog floated in mid-lep across a puddle. But something about walking into unfamiliar places stirred something awake. The neighborhood was older, with buildings of brick and wrought iron. Ivy climbed up walls that had not been touched in over a year. A cafe on the corner still had chairs set outside, one leg of each balanced carefully on uneven pavement. Inside, the smell of coffee had long since faded, but the memory of it seemed to linger. A woman behind the counter stood frozen with a cup in each hand, eyes half-lidded, a small smile on her lips. She might have been laughing at something, or thinking of someone. That was the mystery. Every face caught mid-thought, but the thought itself forever hidden. One of the chairs was pulled out, and for a while it felt like sitting in the middle of a painting, a scene that no longer moved but still held shape. A breeze might once have passed here. A laugh might once have risen from a corner table. That day nothing came, only the soft creak of wood and the shifting of weight in a seat designed for company. In the distance, a bell tower still stood tall. Each visit to that quiet courtyard revealed new textures, the shimmer of light on the droplets, the pale green of moss curling along the base, the small, delicate spider web that had anchored itself in the crook of a stone lion's mouth and never trembled. Always the same, always just a little different when seen slowly enough. If hands could brush against stone, could they also adjust the position of a limb? Could a head be tilted, a mouth turned slightly, a gesture reimagined? The first attempt was tentative. A man sat on a park bench nearby, newspaper in hand, one leg crossed over the other. He wore glasses, thick frames, resting crookedly across his nose. Gently, they were nudged into place, just enough to align with where they might have rested naturally. Nothing changed. The air did not react. The world did not push back. There was no resistance, just stillness, accepting and indifferent. That small success invited another. A child was paused mid-stride in front of an ice cream cart. That was the word that kept returning, like sculptures in a gallery, curated, considered, posed, and yet something kept unraveling inside. It was during one of these quiet edits, shifting a woman's hand to rest on her son's shoulder at the steps of a museum, that the weight of it finally settled. The boy's face, so soft in its paused expression. The book was open to a chapter about constellations. It would have been easy to press their hands together to make them hold the book as one, but it felt impossible, like interfering with a memory that did not belong. The moment they were in had been theirs, not mine, and no arrangement of limbs could recreate what had already been lost to stillness. From that point on, the scenes previously touched began to feel different, wrong. Even the smallest of changes stood out now. A scarf adjusted too carefully, a hand posed too artfully, a head tilted at an angle no longer entirely natural. What once seemed like playful sculpting now looked more like vandalism, not in the way that broke or ruined, but in the way that misunderstood. Each alteration, however well-meaning, had wiped away the truth of a moment and replaced it with a guess. A slow retreat followed. One by one, the changed scenes were returned to as best they could be. Arms repositioned, objects replaced, faces left untouched. And in that quiet act of undoing, something like apology settled into the muscles, not loud, just a small ache in the chest, the kind that comes when something beautiful is touched too hard and loses its shape. No more rearrangements were made after that. The world was left as it had been found. Each person, each gesture, each forgotten smile, frozen not in perfection, but in honesty. Because even now, in the absence of motion, there was dignity in the way. Someone had once stood with their back straight, or tilted their head in thought, or rested their hand on a table just so. These postures held more truth than anything created after the fact. Instead of changing, the focus shifted to observing. A kind of reverence grew for the way a curtain had blown outward just before freezing, for the shadow cast by a man turning toward a bakery, for the way a woman had dropped her purse and her keys had tumbled across the pavement. These were the moments that mattered now, not the ones crafted, but the ones discovered, unfiltered, uninterrupted. Back at the apartment, the journal entries deepened. Less about events, more about impressions. The curve of a smile on a stranger's face. The crease in a skirt caught by the wind. The half-finished crossword puzzle on a park bench, pencil still resting against the paper. Each detail became its own kind of story, written in a language of pause and possibility. A language where meaning came not from what happened next, but from what had nearly happened before everything stopped. There was comfort in that, strange as it seemed. A shift in perspective, the realization that stillness did not mean absence, that motion was not the only way to prove life had occurred, and that sometimes the act of witnessing, really witnessing, was enough to keep something alive in memory, even if it never moved again. Eventually, the journal pages began to include drawings, not skilled ones, just sketches in the margins. A hand reaching for a doorknob, a shoe balanced on the edge of a step, a coat draped over a cafe chair. Each image tried to capture the exact shape of something before it had a chance to fade. Not to change it, but to remember it, to honor it. And with that came a new kind of stillness. One not born of frozen time, but of quiet acceptance. The need to rearrange, to inject meaning, or play God had melted away, replaced by something softer, a kind of listening, a patience that did not demand motion, that simply let things be what they were. On one long walk through a residential neighborhood, a man was found watering his garden. The hose had frozen mid-dark, water stalled halfway between nozzle and soil. His face was turned slightly upward toward the sun. There was a smile there, not wide, but content. Behind him, a radio had fallen from a windowsill, the cord still hanging. No music played, but somehow it felt like there had been music once, and that it had been enough. No attempt was made to move him, not even to pick up the hose or tilt the radio back into place. The moment held its own meaning, untouchable and whole. It asked for nothing and gave everything. And so the walk continued, not as a search for control or discovery, but as a pilgrimage through frozen time. Each step a nod of respect, each window passed, each door unopened. A silent agreement that even in a world without motion there was still something sacred in leaving things just as they were. It started slowly, like most things do, in silence. A hesitation more than a thought, a pause of the hand before placing something down. There had been so much movement in the early days, so many rooms explored, streets wandered, shelves emptied, doors tested. But now everything had begun to settle, as though the stillness outside had seeped into me too. Not in a hopeless way, more like moss growing over stone, quiet and certain. Each morning, or what felt like morning since the sky never changed, I would rise from the same bed, wash with the same water, eat from the same small collection of food, and choose a place to be for a while. That day, it had been a small yellow house on the corner of a street I did not know the name of, with curtains drawn halfway and a dusty piano resting against one wall. The room had a certain shape to it that made everything feel gentle. Rounded furniture edges, soft wallpaper with faded vines, and a single framed photograph that someone had once cared enough to hang above the fireplace. It showed two boys and a woman between them, her arms wrapped tightly across their shoulders, their eyes half squinting against the sun. Their joy was mid-laughter, as if captured just before they all leaned forward to tell a secret. A small crack in the glass had splintered out from one corner, but the smiles had not faded. Without thinking, I removed the frame from the nail and took a nearby cloth and began wiping gently along the wood and glass, not scrubbing, just enough to return it to something a bit more remembered. When I placed it back, it leaned at a slight angle that made it seem as though the woman's face was turned a little more toward me. That was when it began. Not the cleaning itself. I had done that before, but the way my hands started noticing the smallest of things. Buttons loose on jackets resting by front doors. Pages of open books bent back too far. Shoes that had lost their neat pairing. These were not things I needed to fix. No one would see them, and no one would care, but something in me had started to reach for them anyway, like a quiet agreement had been made between the frozen world and the part of me that was still moving. Not a job, not a duty, just a soft instinct, the kind that grows when no one is watching. Later that day, in another home, this one with blue walls and a porch where someone had once left a steaming cup of coffee. Mid-sip, I found a plant drooping in its ceramic pot. Water no longer poured from taps, but the showers still ran, and I had taken to collecting what I could in pitchers left beneath them. I brought some to the plant and poured slowly into the soil and watched as the moisture sank down out of sight. It would not thrive, not in this paused world, but maybe it would not die either. Maybe this little offering would be enough to let it rest peacefully, knowing someone had remembered it. Small things became a rhythm after that. A stray toy tucked back into its basket, a wrinkled blanket smoothed over a chair's arm, a crumpled napkin removed from a plate. It was not cleaning, not really. It was more like recognition. Each act a whisper. I see you, you mattered. Someone still notices. And though no voice replied, and no sign confirmed that anything had changed, something in the air began to feel different. Not alive exactly, but not as abandoned. In a bedroom near the top floor of a row house, I found a journal left open on a nightstand. The writing inside was small and slanted a looping cursive with ink that had bled just a little from the pen. The entry read only a few lines. She called again today, said the same thing. I said I understood, but I do not think I do. There was a name signed at the bottom and a flower drawn beside it. Then I closed the journal softly and placed it on the pillow, as if its writer might return and feel that something in the room had shifted toward comfort. That evening, in a bakery where loaves had been halfway sliced and sugar still hung in the air, I found a note taped to the register. It read, "Back in 5 minutes," with a crooked, smiley face, like someone had drawn it too quickly. I slipped the paper into the drawer beneath the counter instead, and nestled it between a few paper clips and an old receipt. The message was the same, the placement different. A small kindness, perhaps only for myself. Over time, the idea of leaving something behind began to take shape. Not just corrections or repairs, but traces of care. I started folding paper into small cranes, leaving them in unexpected places. One on a dashboard, another in a boot, a third tucked inside a mailbox. The folds were not precise, but the shapes held. I imagined someone waking up and finding one, wondering how it got there, maybe smiling just a little before brushing it aside. Even if that moment never came, even if none of them ever opened their hands to see what had been left, it mattered to me that something had been offered. In the aisles of a bookstore, a handwritten poem was found resting between pages of a biography. It seemed the right kind of sentiment for this world. A whisper not meant to be answered, only sent out into the still air with care. Some days I would spend hours just walking, placing little offerings where they might someday be found. It was the gentleness of the act that made it feel like something whole, like I was still connected to a web that had long since gone still. And the only way to keep it from fading entirely was to keep touching its threads, however lightly. There were still mornings where the hush felt heavy, where even the smallest creak of a floorboard sounded too loud, but the acts of care changed the shape of the silence. Not for time to resume, or for people to stir, but for the possibility that being kind, softly, quietly, invisibly, might be enough, might be the only thing left to offer a world that no longer knew it could be loved. The house I returned to each evening had begun to gather its own small collection of offerings. A quilt found in a cedar chest now laid across the bed, a glass jar filled with buttons of every shape and size. The space had become not just a place to sleep, but a reflection of the kindness gathered elsewhere. A quiet echo of every note tucked into coat pockets and every crease made in folded paper. Once near a fountain that had long since stilled, I placed a bouquet, dried flowers tied with a shoelace, at the feet of a statue. It was not a grand gesture, but something about it made the statue seem more awake, as if it too had been waiting for someone to remember that things could be beautiful even when frozen. I sat there for a long time, not thinking, not hoping, just existing beside it, breathing beside a world that no longer did. These small kindnesses were not performed for meaning or memory. They did not fill the silence or cure the ache, but they softened the edges. They gave shape to the days. They reminded me that life, even when paused, could still be touched with care. And in a world where nothing moved, that was more than enough to keep going. The house had grown quieter, if that was even possible. Stillness had long since become my closest companion. But there were moments, especially in the early mornings, when it felt even more pronounced. The kind of silence that wraps itself around the ribs and hums softly behind the ears. Not oppressive, just present. A companion of its own breathing, slower than I ever could, existing just to remind me that the world had paused and left me to carry on. The habit started one afternoon with a half-sharpened pencil and a notepad found in the kitchen drawer of a house I had never lived in before. The pages were meant for groceries, for quick reminders, maybe for phone messages that would never be returned. Instead, they became the first canvas for words that had nowhere else to go. It was not planned. There was no resolution made in the mirror, no inner vow to begin documenting thoughts. It happened the way breathing does, quietly, automatically, because something within needed release. The first note was simple, just a line or two, barely more than a whisper in ink. Something about how the sunrise looked from that particular kitchen window, how the light touched the toaster and made even the dull metal look golden. Nothing profound, nothing meant to last. But that small act, that movement of thought into form, gave shape to the long days in a way nothing else had managed to. Words created motion in a world where everything else stood still. Soon the habit grew, not with urgency, but with rhythm. Pages began appearing in odd places, slipped beneath windshield wipers of frozen cars, folded into the coat pockets of people on street corners, nestled between the pages of library books that would never be returned. No names were signed, no explanation offered, just quiet thoughts scattered across a silent city. Notes left like footprints in fresh snow meant to vanish under the next falling flake, but existing all the same. Some days the words came easily. Descriptions of remembered laughter, of favorite songs, of smells that lingered in forgotten hallways. Memories surfaced like bubbles in a still pond, each one rising gently until it broke into the open air. Writing them down was like tracing the outline of something that had once felt solid, not to hold onto it, but to prove it had been real. That at one point there had been voices and footsteps and warmth shared between people who now stood unmoving in time's halted frame. Other days the words were heavier. Regrets had their own gravity, pulling at the edges of the page. Whole letters were written to people who would never read them. Apologies long overdue. Confessions that once seemed too difficult to say aloud. Secrets unraveled themselves, slowly inked out with care, folded neatly, and left behind in places that seemed fitting. A note about guilt resting in a church pew. A thank you tucked beneath a school desk. The act of writing, even without response, became its own form of forgiveness. The world around me remained unchanged. Still faces caught mid-laughter, hands suspended in gesture, coffee paused mid-pour. And yet with each note, the stillness felt less final, less like an ending, more like a pause filled with potential. These letters, invisible as they were to their recipients, felt like a bridge, a fragile one perhaps, but a bridge nonetheless, a way to reach across the frozen void and touch something human. Over time, the notes began to take on new forms, not just letters, but small poems, lists of remembered dreams, fragments of conversation I missed hearing, bits of overheard speech that used to make me smile. There was something comforting in preserving these things, even if no one else would ever know. It gave shape to a life that no longer had routine or structure, a scaffolding built not of time but of thought. There were days when pages were strung up on clotheslines fluttering gently in the unmoving air, waiting for a breeze that would never come. Other days they were rolled into tiny scrolls and slipped into old glass bottles, left floating in fountains or perched atop doorsteps. Some were pinned to bulletin boards, in corner their handwritten messages blending in with long-forgotten event flyers and lost pet notices. All of it done with a tenderness that no longer had anywhere else to go. The city, though, frozen, became a kind of living journal. Each street held a memory, each window a story. And through these silent letters, that story unfolded in gentle pieces. There was no need to explain who wrote them or why. The words carried themselves quiet and complete. If anyone were to ever awaken and stumble upon one, perhaps they would understand, or perhaps they would not. That part no longer mattered. Writing changed the texture of the days. It created a pattern that, while not quite purpose, resembled it closely enough. There was calm in the act of forming letters, in watching ink trail across a page, even if no eyes would follow it later. It felt like a conversation, one half spoken aloud, the other floating endlessly in the stillness, like talking to the air and finding peace in the echo. Notes written in the form of fictional postcards from places never visited, signed by imaginary friends. Recipes invented on the spot using ingredients scavenged from silent grocery aisles. Love letters addressed to no one in particular, full of grand declarations and soft metaphors tucked gently beneath bouquets placed in frozen florists' shops. The world became a canvas, not just for memory, but for playfulness, for warmth, for invention. Evenings were when the letters grew softer. The light faded more slowly than it used to, casting long, unmoving shadows across pavement and walls. In those hours, the pages held more quiet truths, descriptions of the way lamplight brushed across frozen faces, how the stillness seemed almost tender in its embrace. The ache of memory, softened by time, set down gently in cursive script and left where it might one day be found. Speech grew quiet too. At first, there had been monologues, questions thrown into the open air, even laughter at a thought or a memory. But eventually, the silence between words lengthened. There were no conversations to be had, and over time, the muscles that formed words felt less certain, as if even the mouth had forgotten its rhythm. When sounds did come, they were softer, hummed songs under breath, the whisper of a sentence not quite finished. Language had become more about sensation than communication. Words were no longer for others. They were for texture, like the grain in wood or the pattern in cloth. Even footsteps changed. In earlier days, they echoed boldly through empty streets, bounced against walls of quiet shopping malls, tapped confidently through abandoned train stations. Now they had softened, slower, more careful, not out of fear, but reverence. Every space entered felt like a museum, not of art or history, but of people, of lives paused mid-breath. Moving through them became an act of ceremony, a hand gently adjusting a coat sleeve that had slipped, a chair nudged slightly inward beneath a dining table, a child's toy repositioned beside their frozen hand, not to fix, but to honor. It was somewhere between those softened movements and echoing rooms that something else began to fade. Ambition, not just the grand kind, but the simple urges that used to guide a person from one hour to the next. There were no schedules to follow, no meals to prepare, no deadlines to race toward. Days no longer had destinations. They simply happened. Meals became less about taste and more about comfort. Sleep came without routine, sometimes in chairs, sometimes curled on soft rugs beneath skylights. There were no alarms to wake to, no events to plan for. The pressure to be a certain version of oneself slipped away, like a coat shrugged off in warm weather. The loss of urgency brought its own kind of quiet clarity. So many versions of a self had been shed over time: student, worker, friend, stranger, observer. All names once wrapped around a life that was now unbound. There was no one left to remind who someone had been, no reflection strong enough to anchor it. Instead, identity became more like weather. It shifted. Some days were wrapped in melancholy, others in strange joy. Mornings carried a sense of openness, evenings a softness touched with longing. Feelings came and went like seasons, unannounced and unmeasured. Memories, too, began to loosen. Not the important ones, they stayed, anchored by emotion and repetition. But the small ones frayed at the edges. Names of street corners, the colors of old rooms, the taste of certain meals. Faces seen in dreams returned clearer than ones known in life. Dreams themselves became indistinguishable from memory. Sometimes there were whole conversations with people never met. Long walks along paths that never existed. But when waking came, there was no way to tell if it had truly ended. The stillness of the world outside the window always looked the same, and in that stillness the question returned. Quiet but persistent. Was there still a person here, or only someone moving through the shape of one? Without others to see or speak or reflect, the edges of self had softened. Maybe it did not matter. Maybe being was enough. Maybe continuing was all that remained. The need for a title or role, a name or a goal, had faded. In its place there was just presence, just one breath, and then another. No answers, no audience, just the sound of fabric brushing against a chair, a kettle filled though it would never boil, a journal closed after a page that may never be read. Even now, with years piled softly behind like fallen leaves, the question of who once was did not bring sorrow, only quiet curiosity. Somewhere in that drifting identity, something human still pulsed, gentle, steady, unassuming, a heartbeat without a reason, a rhythm without a song. Not everything needed a shape to be real. Not every presence needed to be declared. Some things just were, and maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what remained when everything else had paused. Somewhere between the 10th winter and the unnamed seasons that followed, the motion inside me slowed. Not from sorrow or despair, not even exhaustion, but from a quiet sense that the walking could finally end. My feet no longer itched with the old need to keep moving, to find some final place where answers lived. That restless energy which once pulled me through alleyways, across rooftops, into forgotten cabins, and over bridges that groaned under the weight of still cars. It had softened. One afternoon, beneath a canopy of rust-colored trees, whose leaves had long since stopped falling, I saw a little house at the bend of a mossy road, tucked between ivy-covered fences and half-crumbling garden statues. Something about it felt different, though not extraordinary. It was not a grand home, or even particularly charming, but it looked like a place where someone had once cared. The front door was slightly ajar, a sliver of the hallway inside visible from the porch. Its wood was pale from weather and time, its brass knob dulled to a gentle amber. I stood there for a long while, not knocking, not stepping inside, just letting the air settle around me, as if I were waiting for the silence itself to speak. When I finally entered the stillness, inside the home was no different than anywhere else. A coat still hung from a hallway hook, a glass of water balanced on a side table beside an open book. A television paused mid-flicker, yet something invisible had shifted. The house did not feel like a stage set or a museum room. It felt like breath had passed through it recently, like warmth had seeped into the wood and refused to leave. Maybe the truth was simpler. It had been loved. The living room walls were faded blue with tiny hairline cracks. A patchwork of frames lined the shelves, each holding faces I did not know but felt comforted by. A boy grinning with cake on his face, a couple laughing on a porch, a woman in a scarf squinting into sunlight. I did not disturb the photos. Instead, I rearranged them just slightly, as if centering them could bring a small bit of reverence. In the kitchen, a calendar hung crooked. stuck on a month-long since past, with a few birthdays circled in red ink. I left it there. The dining table bore the marks of time, rings from teacups, tiny knife scars from dinners past. It was beautiful, in the way that only worn things can be. In the days that followed, I returned again and again. I began clearing dust from windowsills, folding throw blankets, adjusting cushions. The house accepted it all without resistance, like a dog lifting its head slightly at a familiar hand. I never felt the need to claim it or rename it. The place did not belong to me, not in any ownership that could be spoken aloud. But it became something more sacred than possession. It became a refuge, a shelter not just from the weather, but from the weight of the wandering itself. I began bringing small things into the home, not souvenirs or trophies, just traces. A flower clipped from a frozen garden, a newspaper stuck mid-fold, an old record that would never play again. These were not for decorating, not for filling space, but for creating some echo of motion in a world that no longer moved. Each item held a kind of presence, not alive, but gently awake, in the way a seashell still remembers the ocean. Slowly, I carved out rhythms, morning tea made from herbs foraged between hedgerows, midday walks through the same looping path in the neighborhood, boots brushing against unmoving leaves, evenings spent reading aloud, not to anyone in particular, but just so the sound of a voice could exist again in a room. Out back, the garden waited in partial bloom, frozen stalks, stiff blossoms that never wilted. I began tending it anyway, not in any hopeful sense of growth, but for the ritual of care itself. I weeded between the cracks of stone paths, pulled vines from fences, brushed dirt away from roots. One day, after many quiet efforts, a seed sprouted, just one, a stubborn green push through gray soil. It should not have been possible. Nothing had grown since the world stopped, but there it was, trembling slightly in the windless air. I watched it for hours, unsure whether I was hallucinating or witnessing some small kindness from the universe. Either way, it reminded me of the idea of time, not as a force, but as a possibility. The house taught me how to be still in a new way, not the stillness of the frozen world, but one that chose quiet over motion. Within its walls, loneliness became something softer, something that could be cradled instead of endured. I began talking to the rooms as I moved through them, not conversations exactly, but murmurs, greetings, apologies, stories. The house never replied, of course, but in its silence I found something that resembled presence. When sleep came, it came more gently. Dreams returned to blurry, soundless things, but filled with movement and shadows that held hands. There was comfort in waking up beneath a familiar roof, even if no one else breathed beneath it. Some nights I lit candles in the window, not expecting anyone to see, but just to let the house glow a little from within. A beacon for nothing, perhaps, but it felt right. On colder evenings, I would drape a quilt over the arm of the couch and imagine someone settling there, stretching tired legs and exhaling the kind of sigh that only homes can draw from people. I left bowls of fruit on the counter, even if they never rotted, tucked slippers beneath the bed, straightened the doormat with the word welcome faded, nearly invisible. Every so often, I would find myself standing by the threshold, unsure if I was meant to leave again. My hands would hover near the doorframe, knuckles brushing against paint, feeling for some invisible current, but no urgency came. The rest of the world waited, unchanged, still caught mid-thought. There was nowhere left to chase, no new cities to stumble into. This house had taken me in, not by invitation, but by recognition. It knew the shape of someone who had nowhere else to be. Even my name, once repeated in the dark like a spell to keep myself anchored, began to fade from daily use. The need to define who I had been dulled beneath the comfort of simply being. I became the person who brewed tea at sunrise, who whispered thanks to plants that did not grow, who left poems in the drawers just to feel a little brave. The walls never asked me for explanations. They accepted me exactly as I arrived, dusty and changed, tired in ways I could not name. And in return, I treated the house not as shelter, but as witness. At some point, months or years, there is no way to measure, I placed photos of strangers on the mantel, not because they resembled anyone I knew, but because their smiles deserved somewhere to be seen. I dusted the glass gently each week. Next to them, I placed a small mirror, tilted just enough to catch afternoon light, a reminder that faces still mattered, that even in a paused world, reflection could be a kind of companionship. The house had become something I had not known I needed. Not a restart, not a hiding place, but a quiet choice, a place to say, this is where I stand. Not forever, just for now, a patch of stillness inside the stillness, made sacred not by who built it, but by what it allowed me to remember, that even in a world forgotten by time, warmth could be made, not by grand gestures or desperate hope, but by simple presence, by stacking books, by folding blankets, by staying. The seasons outside never turned, but something inside did. The small house beneath the trees held its shape with patient grace, while the body that lived within it slowly gave way to time it was not supposed to have. Hands that once lifted stacks of books without a thought now paused on the third or fourth volume, choosing softer bindings, thinner spines. Knees that used to bend easily to kneel near the stubborn little patch of garden began to protest. So a low stool was dragged out there and left beside the soil, waiting each morning like a faithful companion. The mirror in the hallway, the one tilted slightly to catch the afternoon light, revealed lines that had not been there before, and a softness around the eyes that belonged to someone older, gentler, less hurried. The voice, when it came, sometimes cracked halfway through a word, and it made no sense to clear the throat. There was no audience to hear the strain, no one to ask if everything was all right. The air accepted the sound, just as it accepted the silence. The house grew warmer with age, or maybe it only felt that way because the body within it needed warmth more than it used to. Blankets were tucked into every room, draped over chairs, folded neatly at the foot of the bed. A small collection of shawls, knit by unknown hands and rediscovered in old trunks, became regular companions on the slow walks to the window and back again. Those walks did not measure distance anymore. They measured breath. They measured the little decisions that made up a day, whether to read by the mantel or near the kitchen door, whether to hum while rinsing apples in the last clear water saved in bottles, whether to light a candle in the evening, even if the flame offered no heat, only company. Choices were small now, but they were still choices, and there was a kind of gratitude wrapped around every one. Some days muscles ached before the sun, if the sun could still be called, that had shifted an inch. On those days, the chair by the window was enough. A book rested open, but the eyes slipped from the words and onto the street, where neighbors never moved, where a mail carrier still paused mid-step, where a dog stood in perfect poise at the edge of a fence caught between bark and breath. A soft greeting would be offered, not with expectation of return, but with the simple politeness that had been taught long ago and had never been fully unlearned. The voice sounded older now, lower, slower, but kinder too, as if talking to a child or a friend at the end of a long day. Sometimes the whisper was just a name invented for the person outside, a gentle title for a figure that never looked up. It made the heart remember that names once mattered, and with that memory came a tenderness for every frozen face passed on the quiet paths. On better days, old roots called gently from the edges of memory. Roads once walked in the first year after the stillness, and then abandoned in favor of the little house now tugged at the feet like old songs. The path to the bell tower, with the fountain still caught mid-arc, seemed shorter now, perhaps because there was no hurry to reach it. This time, the walk was not to discover anything. It was to revisit, to honor the shape of a life that had been lived in steps and stumbles and little pauses. When the fountain came into view, its suspended droplets seemed kinder than before, as if they had softened with time to move. A bench nearby offered a seat, and the bones welcomed it gratefully. Fingers rested on cold wood, as though on an old friend's shoulder. A soft apology might be offered for taking so long to return, followed by a promise to come again. The journal, the one that had been written in with great energy in the early days and then with steadier rhythm later, now filled with shorter entries, but deeper ones. The pen did not always glide so smoothly, and the hand sometimes trembled enough to turn a word into something new. But the paper did not ask for neatness. Reflections slipped out in sentences that no longer asked why this had happened. That question had given way years ago, dissolved into the quiet acceptance that no answer would come, but leaned instead on another one. What was done with it? There were no grand triumphs to record, no miracles to claim, but there were small things, and the more they were named, the more they mattered. A plant watered, a stranger's picture dusted and straightened, a room organized so it would greet someone gently if ever someone returned to be greeted, a note tucked into a pocket just in case, a song sung softly into a quiet stairwell, simply because stairwells once carried voices into the world. Memory grew gentle, loosening its grasp on dates, names, and order, but holding tighter to textures, smells, and light. The weight of a thick wool coat worn in the year of long snow that never fell. The smell of cinnamon pilfered from the back of an unmoving cafe. The way dust shimmered in beams of light that never shifted. The feel of cold banisters smooth from other people's hands. The sound of heels on marble floors in museums that were always empty. These were the memories that stayed, not as film reels, but as touchstones. Sometimes it was enough just to sit with them in silence, allowing them to drift through the mind the way a breeze should have drifted through the house. Every now and then there was a visit to a place left intentionally untouched. A child's bedroom with signs on the wall made with marker and tape. A desk scattered with crayons now forever, midway through a drawing. A note still taped to the door. Please knock before you come in. Permission would be sought quietly, a hand placed against the door, a whispered "may I," and then the step inside, taken with reverence. Nothing was moved. Nothing needed to be. The room did not require fixing or rearrangement. It required acknowledgement. that was all. A gentle nod to the life that once unfolded there, and the life that now passed quietly in its presence. The house itself grew older in the way beloved things do, not through decay, but through deepening character. The creaks in the floor became signals, not annoyances. The slight draft near the kitchen window became a reminder to place another quilt over the chair. The dimming of certain lights was not a loss, but an invitation to rely on others. When the body tired, even small tasks became rituals of care. Washing a dish slowly, folding the same sweater again and again until the fabric lay just right, moving a cup from one shelf to another and back again because it felt right to do so. These were not the actions of aimlessness, but of someone who had learned to be deliberate in a world that hurried no one. Visitors existed without arriving. The mind learned to make room for imagined footsteps, familiar scents, voices that once cut in and told a story too long or a joke too short. The faces came less clearly now, but their presence did not weaken. Sometimes a chair was pulled out, as if for someone who always sat there. A second cup was placed on the table, not filled, but present. The act itself created a sense of fullness in a space that might otherwise have felt empty. It was not denial, it was devotion to memory, to possibility, to the simple notion that connection can live even when conversation cannot. With age came a softness toward the past self, the one who wandered aimlessly through the city, who rearranged the world like a puzzle to be solved, who whispered apologies to statues and lampposts and doorways, as if they could respond. That self had done the best it could. It had searched, experimented, played, broken, mended, and ultimately learned to love without any expectation of return. There was no shame in that, and no regret, only gratitude that it had kept moving long enough to reach this quieter shore. It would sometimes happen that a place returned to perhaps a rooftop once used for singing felt completely different, even though nothing had changed. That was the trick of time within the only person who still felt it. The world around remained unaltered, but perspective did not. What once felt like a blank horizon now felt like a gentle ending, not an abrupt one, not a door slamming shut, but the slow dimming of a long, warm light. The body would lean against the railing and watch the city hold its breath, and a whisper would slip out into the air, not addressed to anyone, and yet somehow intended for everyone. Thank you. The garden never grew beyond that one small shoot, but tending it never stopped. There was a lesson there, though no effort was made to define it. Care was not a contract, it was a gesture. The hands that watered, trimmed, and cleared had learned that care did not need to lead to change to be meaningful. Care could be its own languagey way of saying, I am here, and so are you, without either party needing to move. As years settled into the bones like a familiar ache, the fear that had once moved in shadows left. Not all at once, it dwindled. Fear of being alone eventually gave way to acceptance, then to something kinder, companionship with the silence itself. Fear of being forgotten no longer mattered. There was no one left to forget, and no one left to be forgotten by. What mattered was the quiet answer to the question that had finally reached its simplest form. What was done with it? The house answered. A home was made. The streets answered. They were walked gently. The faces outside the window answered. They were honored. The journals answered. They were written in until the hand slowed. The letters hidden under benches and stitched into coat pockets answered. They existed in case someone someday needed them. Every part of this paused world had been met with care, and the body that moved through it had become softer for having cared. Nights felt longer, but not emptier. The bed was still warmed with blankets, the pillow still shaped to a head that had learned to rest without expectation. Sometimes dreams arrived with voices that did not sound like they belonged to anyone known. Other times, there were no dreams at all, only a deep, restful darkness. In the morning, whatever morning was now, the first breath was still grateful, not loud, not triumphant, but steady. The same breath a song ends with, when the last note fades and the audience holds their applause a second longer than expected, just to sit with the feeling. No more questions remained. Even the ones that had lined the edges of years, stubborn and sharp, had softened, blurred, drifted back into the fog. No more arguments with fate, no more pleading with silence. The house beneath the trees did not demand it. The garden did not ask for it. The frozen world did not care for argument, and the person inside it no longer did either. What mattered was simple. A small life built gently, tended without bitterness, completed with grace. A story with no witnesses except for the one who wrote it. A song that the singer could still hear even when no ears remained to listen. When the body slowed enough that a day could be filled just by moving slowly from room to room, it felt like arriving at the final verse of something quietly beautiful. The kitchen, with its stained table and jars of saved buttons, offered a morning greeting. The window seat gifted an hour of rest and memory. The bookshelves overflowing with spines, now familiar in the hands asked to be dusted in the afternoon. The garden more soil than leafax, accepted a final visit with kindness. Then the evening, with its candle that did not quite light, its music imagined more than heard, its ritual of thanking the rooms before sleep. And in that last moment before the mind drifted, a final question arose, not from doubt, but from wonder. What did I do with it? The answer arrived, not in words, but in feeling warm, and complete lived it, gently. And the hush that followed felt like the softest kind of applause. The morning felt heavier than most, not in any painful way, but like a quilt that had settled with more weight than usual. There was a hush in the air that could not be traced to any one thing, just a softness that clung to the bones before the day began. Fingers ran along the familiar curve of the bed's edge, resting there longer than necessary, as if to acknowledge the years spent rising from that very spot. The floor creaked in its usual rhythm beneath tired feet, and the house gave its gentle greetings, windows blinking open with light that had not changed in a decade. It was all still here, exactly as it had always been, and yet something in the way the hand lingered on the doorknob, the way the eyes scanned the shelves, made it clear that this day would be different. The walk began without ceremony, no packing, no speeches, no sense of finality. Just the door easing open on its hinges and the familiar footfalls onto the stone path that curved beneath the trees. They had not bloomed, not really. Their leaves had held the same pose for years, locked in a sort of eternal spring that never ripened into summer. But the bark had worn smooth in some places from gentle touches over time, and moss had begun to curl up their roots, as if even the stillness could not stop certain kinds of growth. One hand reached out and brushed the trunk in passing, not a farewell, more a thank you. The streets welcomed with the same silence they always had. A row of parked bicycles remained angled at perfect attention near the bookstore, their tires never flattening, their chains never rusting. A newspaper flapped mid-air in a breeze that had never landed. The pages had yellowed just slightly in the hands of time's one remaining witness. The building's awnings still cast the same shadows on the brick below, though the eyes that saw them now saw not geometry, but memory. That corner where a stranger's dog had once wagged its tail just before the world froze. That bench where thoughts were once scribbled into the journal with shaking fingers. That window where, for a while, someone frozen inside seemed to be smiling at just the right angle. None of it had changed, but somehow all of it had grown full. Each step came slower than the last, not from weariness alone, but because every step held 1,000 moments. The coffee shop was still halfway through brewing a pot. The scent had long since faded from the air, but the gesture lingered in the imagination, the hiss of steam, the clink of ceramic, the warmth of holding something just poured. A finger tapped the rim of a cup on a table near the window, just lightly enough to hear the ceramic ring. The sound was dull, but it traveled, not far, not loud, but enough to remind the heart of mornings long past. The park had always been still, but now it held a kind of sacred quiet. The swings were caught mid-sway. One of them tilted just slightly higher, as if someone had jumped or was about to. Small footprints dotted the sandbox, unmoved for years, yet still filled with the innocence of whatever game had been imagined there. A child's hat lay near the edge, soft wool folded in on itself, forever waiting to be lifted again. The bench facing the fountain had become smoother over time, not from use, but from touch palm, tracing the edge each time the path curved back this way. Sitting there now, the city stretched out like a photograph, still and full of life that refused to be erased. Familiar doors stood closed along the row of townhouses. Each one had once invited in a story, now paused mid-chapter. The third door on the left still had the dent where a bicycle had bumped into it years before everything stopped. A hand brushed over it, pausing for a breath. That dent, insignificant in its day, now felt like proof that someone had lived boldly enough to collide with the world. The door beside it had a wreath hanging that never browned, never sagged. Its colors were as fresh as the morning they were tied together. It had been meant to greet someone. Perhaps it still did. Further on, there was the crosswalk where the couple had been caught mid-step, their hands inches apart. The memory of standing there in the early years came rushing back. How strange it had felt to be the only one who could reach out and close the gap. But it had never felt right. Not then, not now. The hands remained where they were, almost touching, almost alive. A few steps away, the corner store had a register drawer pulled slightly open, coins inside gleaming faintly in the angled light. A receipt still curled from the machine, blank, waiting for a name that would never be entered. The pen near it had long since dried out, but its cap had been placed carefully beside it. A small kindness offered to no one and everyone. A cat sat on a windowsill mid-stretch, its body curved like a comma. That one had been named once, not because it was necessary, but because the rhythm of talking aloud needed a recipient. For a time, that cat had been spoken to every morning, a quiet exchange between two creatures caught in a silent world. The name did not matter now, but the memory of saying it did. A finger tapped gently on the glass, and the cat's frozen eyes caught the light. For just a moment, it felt like it looked back. The library came next. Its doors had been opened once early on, then closed again carefully so the wind would not gather too much dust on the shelves. Books had been borrowed without due dates, returned in silent apology. The same chair near the poetry section still held the shape of its last reader. A hand smoothed over the fabric. No need to sit today. That chair had been home for hundreds of hours, maybe more. It had held tears once and laughter whispered into pages. It had listened without interruption. The shelves stood proud as ever. The smell of ink and paper had faded, but the words still waited. Every story still paused mid-breath, ready to be read again by someone who would never arrive. There was a stretch of sidewalk with a crack shaped like a question mark. It had never been repaired. It did not need to be. That mark had been stepped over every time the path led home, sometimes with careful notice, sometimes not at all. Today it got a moment's pause. A toe nudged a pebble into the bend of the mark, and the shape changed just slightly. A final answer to a question no longer asked. Toward the edge of town, where the streets grew quieter and the houses smaller, there was a laundromat where shirts still spun behind a glass window. The hum of the machine had never reached the ears, but it could still be imagined. That hum had once been recreated in whistles, in foot taps, in kitchen tunes sung to no one. It had been company in its way. The door jingled with its bell every time it was opened, even if the sound came only from memory. Today the bell was left untouched. The machines could finish their endless cycles alone. Near the school, chalk drawings still clung to the pavement. Rain had never fallen to erase them. Little sons with smiling faces, stick figures holding hands, the word "hi" written in shaky block letters. A few lines had faded, more from time than weather, but the meaning remained. One drawing of a house with smoke curling from the chimney had become a favorite, not because it was drawn well, but because of the way the smoke looped like cursive letters, spelling something only the heart could read. A finger traced that smoke one last time before stepping over it. The final turn led to the city square, where statues stood tall and pigeons hung mid-flight above their heads. A child reached toward one, arms stretched in eternal delight. That child had become a landmark, not just in the city, but in memory. Every visit had included a pause there, a nod, sometimes a quiet word. Today, a small bundle of dried flowers was placed gently at their feet, not out of grief, but respect. A recognition of shared time, however lopsided. Eyes closed for a moment, not in weariness, but in peace. Behind them, images came not as dreams, but as gentle returns. The garden with its one stubborn sprout, the child's chalk drawing curling at the edge of the curb, the couple with hands nearly touching. All of it still lived, not in motion, but in memory. There was no need to wonder anymore. No lingering questions hanging in the air like fog. No what-ifs, no what-nexts. Everything that had needed to be said had been whispered to doorways, to photographs, to frozen faces and worn-out shoes. Everything that had needed to be touched had felt the warmth of a passing hand. Nothing had been rushed, nothing had been wasted. The world had given a strange gift, not one asked for, not one expected, but it had been accepted, carried, treated gently. And now that world could rest too. The candle leaned into its final moments. Its flame danced a little lower, a little softer, not in a hurry, not in fear, just in recognition. A rhythm that had played long enough, now ready to quiet. The wax gave one last sigh, folding into itself, and the light dimmed until it was only a glow. The room stayed warm, not with heat, but with presence, with every word ever spoken within it, every breath drawn in silence, every night passed in quiet reflection. That warmth didn't fade when the flame did, it stayed. Breath settled into a slower rhythm, the kind of rhythm the ocean might remember, or a song hummed without an audience. The kind of rhythm that doesn't need to end, only to pause. The world held its breath too, though it had been holding it for a very long time. The difference now was that there was no expectation for it to start again. No clocks ticked, no birds stirred, no morning waited around the corner. There was no next. And that was all right. This was the final second, not marked by any grand gesture, not heralded by any revelation. Just a stillness that felt complete, a hush that carried the weight of a whole life, one lived quietly, strangely, fully, a life no one saw but was still full of moments. The last glance was not to the window or the room or the sky. It wasn't outward at all. It was inward, where all the memories had folded into themselves, like pages in a well-loved book. That book remained open, not to be read again, but to be felt. The body rested, the room held it, the house held the room, the world held the house, and nothing moved, but something had, once, and that was enough. If you're still here with me, thank you. Thank you for walking through this quiet world, for listening softly, for breathing gently beside a story that asked nothing of you but your company. The Otherverse is a place for drifting minds, for heavy hearts, for the curious and the tired. A place where time isn't chased, but floated through, slowly, kindly, without demand. If this story helped you find rest tonight, or even just a small moment of peace, then it has done its part. There are more journeys ahead, different places, different questions, all waiting quietly, like unopened books on a shelf. When you're ready, I'll be here, and when you're not, that's okay too. Sleep well, and remember, even in the stillest worlds, something always moves.